then we have one of the final writings, Serge A. Korff, Effects of the Cosmic Radiation on Terrestrial Isotope Distribution. The canopy thus, the water canopy over the Earth before the flood that caused the water there, that provided the water for the worldwide flood. Volcanic operations, break it up, earthquakes, and so on. And you have 40 days and 40 nights. The canopy thus not only provides an explanation for the present excess of atmospheric helium-3, but also implies that the proportion of cosmic ray neutrons reacting with nitrogen to form radiocarbon would be smaller by the amount reacting thus with the hydrogen. This factor combines with the others mentioned to assure that the percentage of radiocarbon in the carbon dioxide of the antediluvian atmosphere must have been much smaller than at present, because of that canopy protection. Therefore, the radioactivity of smaller living organisms ingesting this carbon dioxide would have been much smaller than that of organisms living at present. Thus, antediluvian organic matter probably would have now have little or no radioactivity if preserved as fossils, even though they may actually have been buried by the flood only a few thousand years ago. Although present radiocarbon activity seems to indicate measurements which detect radioactivities from matter perhaps as much as 70,000 years old, such indications are based upon the assumption of uniformity. This stricture is considered quite serious by Dr. G.N. Plass, who is a specialist in investigations dealing with atmospheric carbon dioxide. All calculations of radiocarbon dates have been made on the assumption that the amount of atmospheric radiocarbon has remained constant. If the theory presented it here of carbon dioxide variations in the atmosphere is correct, then the reduced carbon dioxide amount at the time of the last glaciation means that all radiocarbon dates for events before the recession of the glaciers are in question. Gilbert N. Plass, Carbon Dioxide and the Climate. Post-flood period, carbon-14 proportions dramatically higher. With respect to plants and animals living after the flood, the loss of the Earth's canopy, water canopy, would tend to increase the percentage concentration of carbon-14 in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, since the rate of formation of carbon-14 atoms would be accelerated by the loss of the canopy. On the other hand, the influx of carbon into the atmosphere from the intense volcanism during, after the deluge period must have greatly augmented the carbon-14 content of the atmosphere and oceans as well, probably more than offsetting the increase in C14, at least for some time. Furthermore, the equilibrium condition between generation and decay radiocarbon, which has to be assumed in making any age calculation by this method, would obviously not be applicable for quite a long time after the deluge. Although there quite probably was a marked increase in rate of carbon formation 14 atoms at the time of the deluge, due to the greater effectiveness of the cosmic radiation in this process, after the precipitation of the canopy, it would necessarily have taken many years for the total amount of radiocarbon to have built up a reservoir of such size that the number of atoms being created and dissipated were equal. And this would mean that organisms living in these early years and centuries after the flood would have received a proportionally smaller amount of radiocarbon into their systems than those living in later times, especially in the few hundred years immediately after the flood, during the time when mixing of the atmospheric, oceanic, and biologic carbon was first being accomplished. Would this be true? In his definite book on the subject, Libby says, if one were to imagine that the cosmic radiation had been turned off until a short while ago, the enormous amount of radiocarbon necessary to the equilibrium state would not have been manufactured, at the specific radioactivity of living matter would be much less than the rate of production calculated from neutron intensity. W.F. Libby. The obvious conclusion is that plants and animals living in the early centuries after the flood would have much less radioactivity than would be assumed on the basis of present rates, and therefore would appear to be older than we are. the specific radioactivity increased as time went by, approaching the present equilibrium rates. That is why radiocarbon dates for the last few thousand years have seemed to show a generally good correlation with historically verified chronology. Although there are many discrepancies and a large margin of error the farther back in time comparisons are made. But for earlier dates, the specific radioactivity in the terrestrial environment becomes progressively smaller as one goes back in time. Therefore, when material older than, say, about 4,000 years is analyzed now for radiocarbon, it would certainly be found that the activity was low, and if the age were then calculated on the basis of present equilibrium conditions and rates, it would necessarily be measured to be too old, with the amount of error increasingly progressively with the age of the material. Therefore, the deluge and the associated events adequately explain the data from carbon-14 studies, accounting for the agreement with historically dated recent events, but at the same time indicating that the earlier unverified datings must be too high, as one would infer from the biblical records. Consequently, all the more important of the data from radioactivity methods of geochronometry harmonized perfectly with the biblical records and inferences associated with the creation and the flood. Space does not warrant discussion of all the methods that have been used or suggested, but only those which have been considered the most important and best established. It would be possible by similar analyses to show the essential harmony of the data from these other subsidiary methods, the Ionian method, the Varv chronologies, thermoluminescence, with the biblically established facts of genuine recent creation and universal deluge. These events must be dated only some few thousand years ago, according to the Bible, and the evidence that has been brought against this testimony that has now been shown rather to harmonize quite satisfactorily with it. In fact, it would be highly probable that no method of geochronometry could be devised that would permit determination of dates earlier than the flood, since all such processes, whether geological or meteorological, would almost certainly have been profoundly disturbed and altered by the events of that global cataclysm. The scriptural description is that the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished, and the context shows that this statement comprises the geological earth and the atmospheric heavens. The only possible way in which men can know the age of the earth is by means of divine revelation.